Can you tell me why a rook is more powerful on an open file than on a half-open file? The answer has to do with the rook's ability to penetrate. On an open file, the rook has the option of penetrating the enemy's camp through all possible squares. On a half-open file, the number of possible penetration squares is immediately reduced. From this diagram, how can white further activate his rook? His rook is sitting on the half-open c-file doing a good job. Just because a piece is performing a task doesn't mean it can't be improved. What about the idea of bringing the rook up to the third rank and then moving across to the A file? White could then pressure black's pawn structure from a different direction. How to carry out this operation? The immediate plan of one rook c3, intending rook c3, a3, hitting the a7 pawn has a drawback. If one rook c3, a5, two rook a3, a4, black's a7 pawn is no longer a weakness. Black's a pawn has now connected itself to the head of the a4, b5, c6 pawn chain. In two moves, white has given up his pressure on black's c6 base pawn while allowing black to strengthen his pawn structure. Instead of these moves, white tries another tack. He begins with 1 b4. By playing this move first, white prevents black from moving his pawn to the a4 square. A possible line might go 1 f5, 2 rook c3, rook c7, 3 rook a3. This maneuver is known as a rook lift. Literally, the rook is lifted from the back rank up a file in order to move across a free rank. White's rook lift will allow white to mobilize his rook and move it to a more powerful position. Is this plan original? Not at all. Rook lifts occur very often. They don't always work, only when the pawn structure or the tactics of a given position justify the idea. These first few diagrams reinforce the idea that rooks would prefer positions with lots of open files. However, if there are lots of open files, deciding which one to choose may not be so easy. This is a nice clean position. By now you should know that both sides are going to be locked in a mortal struggle to control the open D file. If you were playing white, you might win with the brilliant strokes 1 rook a d1, 2 rook d7, 3 rook h d1, and so on. Or if you were black, 1 rook a d8, 2 rook d2, and 3 rook h d8 would be equally effective. To the victor go the spoils. Thus the race is on. 1 rook a d1 or 1 rook h d1. And now 1 rook a d8 or 1 rook h d8 is quickly played, opposing white's control of the open D file. Well, so much for the race. What does white do now? He would love to force black to play rook d8 takes d1, ceding control over the D file. But from the diagram position, this can't be done. White decides to go for a rook lift. He plays 2 rook d5. By attacking both the c5 and e5 pawns, black is forced to clarify the position. The d5 square is an outpost in the position. An outpost is a square that can't be attacked by an enemy pawn. The best outposts are those squares that we control. Here, White's outpost is the d5 square. None of Black's pawns defend the square, while two of White's pawns at c4 and e4 attack the d5 square. For the same reasons, Black's outpost is the d4 square. If White had waited to play 2 rook d5, Black would quickly move 2 rook d4. Throughout your chess career, outposts and understanding which squares constitute outposts will be a critical part of mastering chess strategy. A critical principle to understand is this. As pawns move forward, the unprotected squares that they leave behind become potential outposts for the enemy army. After the move 2 rook d5, we move to the next problem. Black is faced with a crisis that he must resolve. If the d5 rook is not captured, Black faces the potential loss of either his c5 or e5 pawn. Black also faces a more deadly threat. Here White threatens to play 1 rook ad1, doubling his rooks on the open d file. The doubling of the rooks is a key strategy with rooks. This doubling of power is also known as creating a battery. Batteries are powerful because they often force an opponent into making a pawn weakness or other concessions. When a queen is present, a rook might work with her to double up and form a battery. Also, when a queen is present, she might even triple up on an open file. Black cannot allow White's rook to roost on the d5 outpost. Also, he doesn't want to face the possible consequences of 1 f6, 2 rook a d1. This move is even stronger than 2 rook takes c5, which wins a pawn but gives up control of the open d file. 2 rook takes d5, 3 rook takes d5. Although White has not yet won a pawn, he is master of the situation. Black's rook is helpless to prevent penetration to the d7 square. This conquest of the opponent's 7th and 8th rank is the ultimate mission of any rook. From these ranks, a rook can perform the maximum damage. After 1 rook takes d5, White can also recapture by 2 c takes d5, following the sage principle of capture towards the center. In this case, 4 e takes d5 would also be reasonable, but by playing 4 c takes d5, White gains a greater influence in the center. Your reasons for not capturing towards the center should be very specific. Keep in mind that in most cases, you will want to capture towards the center. From the position in this diagram, we know that White's half-open file is the c file. Plenty of reason for White to put his rook there. White might play 1 rook c1 and then attempt a rook lift. He might even try 1 rook c1 and try the pawn sacrifice 2 b4 in order to blast his way down to the 7th rank. From Black's perspective, life is bleak. His counterplay is supposed to be his half-open d-file. But what's the solace there? White's d5 pawn is in such a dominating position that all of Black's counterplay along the d-file is effectively snuffed out. This diagram is exactly the same as the previous one, with one subtle difference. White's c4 pawn has been moved back to the c2 square. This small difference of the pawn structure can create a profound change of the plan. we know that white begins 1 rook h d1 and black responds 1 rook h d8, challenging the open d file. Which rook lift to make? Should we try 2 rook d3 or 2 rook d5? Those of you who tried 2 rook d3, give yourself a slap for failing to understand the consequences of your action. For those who thought 2 rook d5 was still best, give yourselves a cookie and send me one too. 2 rook d3, rook takes d3, 3 c takes d3. Instead of having a passed pawn, white has created a backward d3 pawn. Black, being no fool, would immediately place his rook on his half-open d-file with 1 rook d8, and after 2 rook c1, b6, 3 rook c3, rook d4, it is black's rook that occupies an important outpost. Note that from his outpost, black's rook has far more influence than white's. In the previous diagram, white should have played 1 rook d5, rook takes d5, 2 e takes d5, which moves us to... Note the important difference between the two diagrams. White has created a passed d5 pawn. In the previous diagram, white should have played 1 rook d5, rook takes d5, 2 e takes d5, which moves us to... Note the important difference between the two diagrams. White has created a passed d5 pawn, but it is not yet a protected passed pawn. Black to play chooses 1 c4. This move cuts the d5 pawn off from protection by the c2 pawn. Black's rook will have to stop the d5 pawn from promotion, but he will simultaneously be attacking the d5 pawn. A likely continuation is 2 rook d1, rook d8, 3 d6. White has advanced his passed d-pawn a rank, which gives his d1 rook more influence than black's d8 rook. Depending upon the other factors in the position, black might be able to save the game. The difference between the two diagrams, the pawn being on c2 as opposed to the c4 square, considerably changed the plans in the position. The final strategical observation to be made here is that rooks don't like blocking passed pawns. A rook that stands in front of a passed pawn is only there because he has to be. He would prefer to be wreaking havoc upon the opponent's army, not all bottled up as a babysitter. These diagrams show us that all rooks, while having been created equal, can overpower one another based on the pawn structure. Are all open files the same? The question itself implies that the answer is no, and indeed that is the case. Some files are better than others. Here there are two open files, the E and D files. Which one is better for a rook? We don't have enough information to tell, and the E and D files appear to be of equal value. If we were to add a pair of rooks and kings, we would have a position like this. Now that a few more pieces have been introduced, we can indeed make a choice. If it was white to move, he should choose 1 rook d1, grabbing the open d file. The reason will soon be made clear. After 1 rook e8, black counters by grabbing the open e-file. White's next move explains his decision on move 1. He plays 2 king f1, the purpose of which is to stop black from penetrating with his rook. Black, however, cannot prevent similar penetration. Black could still play 2 king f8, meeting 3 rook d7 with 3 rook e7 in order to stop White's rook from causing havoc. Let's see this same idea in a more effective setting. With White to move, he has the choice of moving his rook to the open c or d file. Which to choose? Best is 1 rook c1, grabbing the c file. Now, after 1 rook d8, I put this sign, ? To denote the meaning dubious move. When you see this sign, it means that the player has a better choice of moves. Grabbing the d file, White plays 2 king f1, preparing to penetrate Black's position with his rook. Black plays 2 king f8, returning the favor. White now plays 3 rook c7, penetrating Black's camp. Now 3 rook d2 can be met by 4 rook takes b7, winning a pawn and eventually the game. Let's return to the previous diagram. What would have happened had White chosen 1 rook d1? Then 1 rook c8, 2 king f1, king f8, 3 rook d7. Has White made the same progress as before? No. Black now has the clever response 3 rook c1 check, 4 king e2, rook c2 check, and in order to avoid losing a pawn, White has to retreat with 5 rook d2, blocking the check. These diagrams teach us some important strategical points about open files. One, open files are meaningful if the penetration squares aren't protected. In the previous diagram, although Black's rook took the open e-file, White neutralized his control by moving his king to the f1 square. Black's rook couldn't penetrate White's camp. 2. Given the choice of which open file to take, it is usually better to take the one that is farthest from potential defenders. In the previous diagram, White grabbed the c file. This open file was the one that was furthest from Black's king, which is a potential defender of the open file. In my explanation, I call Black's first move 1 rook d8, a dubious move. Did you guess why? The answer is because Black continued on a course that led to disaster. Now it is clear that White is prepared to penetrate to the 7th rank. The best way to neutralize this plan is by 1 f5, in order to prepare rook f8, f7. Thus, 2 rook c7, rook f7 gets White nowhere. White changes his plan and begins by centralizing his king with 2 king f1. Black plays 2 rook f7. Black is now prepared to play rook f7 d7, and only then to develop his king. White tries 3. Rook c8, check, rook f8. 4. Rook c3, rook f7, and black is putting up a better defense than before. In beginning this tutorial, I started by speaking about rooks. Why? Most players have a terrible time learning to use their rooks. They move them back and forth or don't use them at all. After going through these examples, learning how to use the clumsy rooks isn't difficult at all. In fact, the principles governing rooks are the easiest of all. White to move. Move a rook to control the open file. That's right. White to move. Move a rook to control the open file. You got it right. Black to move. Move a rook to control the open file. Correct. White to move. Move a rook to create the most effective battery. That's correct. Black to move. Move a rook to create the most effective battery. You got it right. White to move. Move a rook to create the most effective battery. Correct. White to move. Move a rook to create the most effective battery. That's correct. Black to move. Move a rook to create the most effective battery. You got it right. White appears to have successfully penetrated to the 7th rank and intends to munch some pawns. How should black play to prevent this? Correct. After the white king moves, king g1 f2, for example, what is the continuation? That's right. Black has doubled on the c file. What can white do to neutralize this advantage? Correct. After rook c5, black is forced to capture on c5. Rook c7 takes c5. How should white recapture? That's right. B takes c5. Who is better after this? That's correct.